Mr. Raymond didn't blame his son for not coming home for Thanksgiving. He just quietly cleared the table set for one. At 82, Raymond Ellis still ironed his shirts every morning. He brewed coffee at 6 a.m., just as he had for the past 45 years, and read the local paper like clockwork. He used to be the one everyone turned to. A former civil engineer, a builder of bridges, both literally and emotionally. He raised 2 kids with a quiet strength and a steady hand. But now those same children hardly called. His texts went unanswered. His advice, once sought after, was brushed aside like an outdated newspaper. One Thursday afternoon in late November, Raymond prepared a modest meal. Stuffing, green beans, turkey breast for 2. But by sunset he realized the second chair would stay empty. No apology, no explanation, just silence. And as he scraped leftovers into the fridge, he whispered to no one in particular, "I guess I've become optional." It wasn't the loneliness that hurt most. It was the shift. The sense that somewhere along the way his role had quietly been rewritten. From father to footnote. From leader to afterthought. Have you ever felt that? Like the older you get, the less you matter. Like the respect you once earned has slowly faded without anyone saying a word. If so, this video is for you. Today, we're going to walk through 6 powerful ways to reclaim your dignity and respect within your own family. These are not about shouting louder, begging for attention, or keeping score. They are about changing how you carry yourself, setting boundaries with grace, and becoming the kind of person others naturally want to respect again. Some of these strategies may surprise you. Others may feel like reminders of the strength you've always had but forgot to use. Either way, if you stay until the end, you'll walk away with clarity, confidence, and a quiet power that cannot be ignored. Because this is what Mr. Raymond chose to do, and it changed everything. The more you try to please them, the easier it becomes for them to overlook you. Raymond used to think love meant giving everything without expecting anything back. When his son asked for help with a down payment on a house, Raymond didn't hesitate. He dipped into his savings, smiled, and said, "This is what parents do." But months later, when he simply needed a hand repainting the garage door, no one showed up. Not a call, not a "sorry, Dad, maybe next week." Just silence. And for the first time, he wondered if generosity without limits had quietly turned him invisible. It's something many older parents do without realizing. They say yes when they want to say not this time. They stay silent when their feelings are bruised. They rearrange doctor visits, miss social events, and swallow opinions just to keep the peace. The heartbreaking truth is that in trying so hard to stay close, many end up being taken for granted. Not because their children are ungrateful, but because consistent self-sacrifice teaches others one dangerous lesson. Your needs come last. Raymond wasn't alone in this. A study by AARP found that 64% of seniors admit they actively suppress their emotions to avoid family conflict. But when you mute your own voice long enough, others stop hearing it altogether. What begins as an act of love quietly becomes a pattern of erasure. Respect is not a reward for compliance. It grows from the courage to live honestly, speak your truth, and value your time as much as anyone else's. The turning point for Raymond came quietly. One afternoon, when his daughter asked if he could babysit last minute for the 3rd time that week, he gently replied, "I love helping when I can, but today I need to rest. Let's find another solution together." She was surprised, but over time she began asking instead of assuming, and that small shift changed everything. Because when you stop living to please, you start living with dignity. And dignity invites respect, not pity. Coming up next, we'll explore why trying to win arguments with your children might be doing more harm than good, and what Raymond learned when he chose a different path. Mr. Raymond's quiet pause made his son stop and truly listen for the very first time. It happened during a Sunday brunch. Nothing fancy, just coffee, toast, and the usual family chatter. His son, now 52, glanced up from his phone and said, half joking, "Dad, that's old thinking. No one does it that way anymore. In the past, Raymond might have snapped back. He might have raised his voice, defended his views, reminded everyone that he'd built bridges and solved engineering problems before his son could tie his own shoes. But this time, he simply smiled, leaned back, and began telling a story from 1969. A story about the day he stood alone in a room of senior engineers, quietly proving that the company's lead designer had made a critical miscalculation. He didn't raise his voice then either. He just did the math and let the numbers speak. That morning at the breakfast table, Raymond didn't win an argument. He didn't even try, but his son's eyes softened. For the first time in years, he didn't see an outdated parent. He saw a man who had lived, who had led, who didn't need to shout to be heard. When parents feel dismissed, the instinct is to push back, to correct, to fight for their place. But here's the difficult truth. The louder you get, the more defensive your children become. Not because they're right, but because no one listens while they're being attacked, especially not from someone they already assume is trying to prove a point. Behavioral psychologists have found that as people age, their emotional regulation becomes more fragile under stress. And when older adults argue to reclaim respect, they're often misread as being irrational or overly emotional. And that perception, fair or not, erodes the very respect they're trying to rebuild. Raymond discovered something powerful in that moment. He didn't need to win a debate to remind his son of who he was. His presence, his calm, his lived wisdom did the talking. Sometimes, a well-placed silence or a simple question can say more than any rebuttal, like, "What makes you believe that?" Or even, "Interesting, tell me more." Because strength isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't raise its voice. In the next part of Raymond's story, we'll see what happened when he stopped waiting by the phone, and how letting go of emotional dependence brought his children closer than ever. When Mr. Raymond stopped calling, his son finally started calling back. Every evening at 7 p.m., Raymond used to sit by the phone. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down he hoped it would ring. Just a quick check-in. A familiar voice, a sign that he was still needed, and when it didn't ring, he told himself, they must be busy, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow often came and went. The silence wasn't loud. It was quiet and slow, like fog rolling in over time. And without realizing it, Raymond's world had begun to revolve entirely around waiting for a call. Then one day, something shifted. A flyer at the local library advertised an oil painting class for adults over 65. He hesitated. He hadn't picked up a brush since high school, but he signed up. Week by week, color returned not just to his canvas but to his life. He began walking to the studio twice a week, laughing with strangers, and even entering his first community art show. Suddenly, Raymond was harder to reach. Not because he was ignoring anyone, but because he had started living again. And that's when the calls came. First, a voicemail from his son, then a lunch invitation, then, "Dad, what have you been up to lately?" It was subtle but real. His children hadn't stopped caring. They had simply stopped feeling responsible for his emotional well-being. And once that pressure lifted, the relationship could breathe again. It's a pattern many older parents fall into without meaning to, believing that being available, present, and emotionally open at all times will keep the bond strong. But too much closeness, especially when one side begins to rely on it for identity or happiness, can feel suffocating. According to the Mayo Clinic, seniors who maintain active, independent lives experience not only better health but deeper, more fulfilling relationships with their adult children. Why? Because relationships grow best when they're free of obligation. Raymond learned that lesson not through distance, but through rediscovery. The more he filled his days with purpose, the more his children respected the space he gave them and the strength he found in himself. Coming up, we'll explore one of the hardest truths to face as a parent. What happens when you never say no, and how reclaiming your boundaries can quietly restore the respect you deserve. The day Raymond stood up, the whole family learned a quiet lesson about kindness. It happened during a casual dinner. His daughter was talking fast, trying to make a point about work, politics, or maybe both. Raymond, now 82, gently added a thought of his own. She cut him off mid-sentence, laughing as she waved him aside. "Dad, no offense, but you don't really get how things work these days." The room went quiet for a second, and instead of raising his voice or withdrawing like he once would, Raymond looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "I'll continue when you're ready to listen." He didn't say it with anger, just presence. And in that one moment, the tone of the room changed. His grandchildren looked up. His daughter blinked and nodded. She didn't say sorry, but she didn't interrupt again either. That's the power of boundaries, not threats, not ultimatums. Just quiet lines that say, "I'm here, but I won't be walked over." It's like a house without a fence. People don't mean to trample the lawn, but if there's no clear border, they assume it's okay. The same goes for respect. If we never define what's acceptable, others fill in the blanks on their terms. Setting boundaries doesn't mean shutting people out. It means showing up with standards. It's not about punishment. It's about presence with clarity. Psychology Today reports that individuals who communicate clear personal limits are respected 73% more often by their family members than those who constantly give in to keep the peace. If you're wondering how to begin, try one of these simple phrases. "I'm happy to discuss this, but I'd like to finish my thought first." Or, "I care about your opinion, but I need you to hear mine too." Even, "Let's pause and try again when we can talk respectfully." These aren't confrontational, they're anchors, and over time they reshape the way others treat you. Raymond didn't draw a hard line that night. He drew a respectful one. And it reminded his family that his voice still mattered, that his presence had weight, that being older didn't mean being silent. Next, we'll look at what happened when Raymond stopped giving more than he received, and how that decision shifted the way his children valued his time, his support, and his love. A gift unacknowledged is a gift soon forgotten. Raymond had always been generous. He didn't think twice when his grandson needed help covering his college tuition. He transferred the money that same day, no strings attached. But what stung wasn't the money, it was the silence. No phone call, no note, not even a "thanks, Grandpa," just a transaction like he was a bank. The next time a request came in, Raymond responded differently. He smiled and said, "I'm happy to help, as long as what I give is seen and appreciated." His voice was gentle but firm, and that one sentence shifted everything. Many parents confuse unconditional love with unconditional giving. They believe that by constantly sacrificing, they'll stay relevant, needed, important. But what often happens is the opposite. When giving becomes routine and unquestioned, it turns into expectation. The more you offer without boundaries, the more it becomes invisible. Children stop seeing your kindness as a gift. They start seeing it as your duty. And when something is expected, it's rarely appreciated. That's not malice. It's human nature. The truth is, real respect doesn't grow from what you give. It grows from what you protect. Your energy, your time, your sense of worth. Learning to say no isn't about being selfish. It's about being intentional. Saying yes only when it aligns with your values, when it feels right, when it honors both you and the other person. There's a quiet power in shifting from giving out of obligation to giving with awareness, from simply giving to offering, from "I'm supposed to "I choose to." Raymond didn't stop helping his family, but he stopped doing it automatically. He turned giving into a conversation, not a condition, and slowly they began to thank him again. Not because he asked, but because they started to see him, not just what he gave. Coming up next, we'll explore how building a life beyond your children isn't abandonment. It's the foundation of lasting respect. And how Raymond's journey from waiting to living changed everything about how his family saw him. That year, for the first time, Raymond's son didn't look at him like an old man. He looked at him like a man. The table was smaller now. Just one setting, a single place mat, no centerpiece, no extra wine glass waiting on the side. Raymond had cooked something simple, just enough for himself. He wasn't expecting company, and he was fine with that. Not because he didn't care anymore, but because he had made peace with who he was, without needing anyone else to validate it. But just as he was pouring gravy over his mashed potatoes, he heard the front door creak open. Footsteps, and then his son's voice. "Dad, mind if I join?" Raymond didn't say a word at first. He just pulled out a second chair, and when they finally sat down, his son looked at him, really looked, and said, "I've been thinking about our old conversations. I miss them, I miss you, and I want to listen now." That moment didn't come from guilt. It didn't come from a sense of duty. It came from something deeper, respect earned not through arguments or sacrifices, but through presence, through change, through quiet strength. Let's remember what brought Raymond to this place. He stopped living to please others and started honoring his own voice. He chose calm over conflict. He let go of emotional dependence and built a life that didn't revolve around waiting. He drew boundaries without anger. He gave with intention, not obligation. And above all, he carried himself with dignity, no matter who was or wasn't watching. You can't force your children to respect you, but you can become someone so grounded, so clear, so quietly powerful that they can't help but see you differently. That's the kind of change that doesn't ask for permission. It simply is. So if you know someone, a friend, a sibling, a neighbor, who's sitting by the phone waiting for a call that never comes, send them this video. Because sometimes the right words at the right time can bring warmth back to a cold season. And if that someone is you, start by writing one promise to yourself tonight. Just one thing you'll never give up again, even for love. That's where dignity begins. And from there, everything else starts to come back. We'll see you in the next video. But for now, take care of you, because you matter. You always have. And it's time the world remembers that.